quite a story. For the second time in 3 years, one of the U.S. servicemen in the iconic flag-raising photo from February 23rd, 1945, had been misidentified and has now been correctly identified. The Marine Corps has acknowledged that the man previously identified as Private First Class Rennie Gagnon is actually Corporal Harold Pye, was his nickname, Keller, and for 74 years, no one knew that. He's the man that you see highlighted in the yellow. So in moments, we're going to speak exclusively with Keller's daughter, who says that her father never spoke of being in that photo, and we'll talk to her about why that might have been. But first, the chief breaking news correspondent, Trace Gallagher, with this incredible backstory tonight. Hi, Trace.
The story is fascinating, Martha. It really is. I mean, there were actually 2 American flags raised on Mount Suribachi in Iwo Jima back in February 23rd, 1945. But commanders thought the first flag was too small, so they replaced it with a second flag, and the second flag raising is when Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal snapped this famous photo. It's also where some of the confusion comes in, because Private First Class Rennie Gagnon, who we thought for 74 years was in the famous photo, actually helped raise the first flag. And now we know it was Corporal Harold Keller, not Gagnon, who helped raise the second flag. And it's fascinating how they solved this. First, a group of historians used film footage atop Mount Suribachi. Then they compared the film to still photos taken by other soldiers from different vantage points. The evidence was then sent to a special investigative board convened by the Marines, and with the help of the FBI's Digital Evidence Lab, the finding was confirmed. In fact, to make the positive ID, investigators used things like Keller's camouflage pattern on his helmet and his wedding ring. Rennie Gagnon was not married, and there was never a doubt that Harold Keller was on Mount Suribachi when the famous photo was taken, because he had the proof hanging in his living room. For many years, Keller had a framed picture of the so-called gung-ho shot of 18 Marines on the summit with the flag in the background that you see there. A picture that was also taken by Joe Rosenthal and also included Harold Keller. His children say their dad never made a big deal of the picture and would say it was a photo of the guys who raised the flag on Iwo Jima. Harold Keller, whose nickname was Pie because he once ate too much pie before a football game, was part of some of the biggest battles in the Pacific Theater and received the Purple Heart. In 1979, Keller died of a heart attack at the age of 57. There was no mention of Iwo Jima in his obituary. Rennie Gagnon was on his gravestone.
Incredible story, Trace. Thank you very much. So we are honored now to be joined by Corporal Harold Keller's daughter, Kay Maurer. Kay, thank you so much for being here today. So tell me a little bit about how you learned that it was your dad in what I would call the most iconic photograph of World War II.
Thank you. Well, I started receiving phone calls from a couple of the researchers, Brent Westemeyer and Dustin Spence, and they started out with, "We know your dad was on Iwo Jima. Do you know what he did there?" And I'm going, "No, not really. He was with the group that went up the mountain, but didn't really know anything much beyond that." And they said, "Well, we'd like to come to your house and kind of fill you in on what your dad did." So then, which they did, and got to meet both of the men, and got to Skype with the man from Ireland, Stephen Foley, and so it was quite an afternoon.
Oh, I mean, it's amazing. And I think a lot of people remember the book and the film Flags of Our Fathers. And I think it's important to point out that Rennie Gagnon was on Mount Suribachi, and as Trace pointed out, was part of the first flag raising. It gets a little confusing because the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines had secured the mountain, and they went up, and there was one flag raising and then a second one. But what I find so interesting, and I'd like to hear about your dad, why do you think, I mean, he obviously knew that he had helped to push that flag into the ground. So why did he never say anything, Kay? Why didn't he tell you or anyone else?
What I'm just guessing here, but what I think is once those other men were identified incorrectly or correctly, for him to then to come back to his hometown of Brooklyn and say, "Oh, no, that was me," I think he just would have been the laughing stock. He didn't speak up at the time, I think at the time, because those men were identified so that they could go back and do a war bond tour. And he would not have wanted to do that. He was the first man from Brooklyn to sign up after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. He was the first man from our hometown. And I think his heart was there fighting the war, not to come back on a war bond tour. And so I think he just mummed up and refused to identify himself when it was asked who were the men. And I think he thought, I'm going to stay here and fight. And Dad would have, I think, not wanted to leave his comrades to go back to the States.
I mean, that is a remarkable story, and I have I've been working on a book on Iwo Jima, so I've interviewed a lot of the men who fought there. Many of them are in their 90s now, obviously, and that kind of humility that you discuss when you talk about your father and how much it meant to him to sort of not be the one in the spotlight or not be the one that was seen as the big hero is a very common thread that I see running through these men, and so it doesn't surprise me at all that your father, Harold Pye Keller, was a guy like that. So what has it been like for all of you? You know, now when you look at that picture, Kay, what goes through your mind?
I'm amazed. I'm proud, so very proud. And then always just this little ache that he didn't tell me, that he wouldn't talk about it. I would have loved to have heard his stories, and he just wouldn't. So proud. Very proud.
As you should be. Kay, thank you for your family's service and your dad's service, and for speaking with us tonight. It's an amazing story, and we are so glad that you joined us. Thank you, Kay.